Hi, welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher. I'm an assistant professor in journalism here at the University of Canberra. Hi, Michelle.
Hello, Caroline.
Hi, we've had a slightly quieter week in politics this week. We've had the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition make a couple of announcements. So the government said the coronavirus travel ban will be extended further until February 29th. It's been in operation for about a month and there's 100,000 Chinese students in limbo. How long can this ban be sustained?
I think the government is quite anxious to find a way of lifting this ban as soon as it can, but it's a trade-off between health security and, if you like, wealth security, the economy. So far the government has been very cautious, putting the health and safety and welfare of Australians to the forefront, of course, as you would expect. But the longer this ban goes on, the more disruption, the more cost to the economy. So I think that the government is looking for some signs that things are improving. It's noting a slowing in cases outside the core affected area. And it has been looking at possibly some very limited arrangements for a cohort of students. But overall, of course, this ban is very difficult for relations with China and for the economy.
It's a delicate balance though, isn't it, this health-wealth question? I mean, where is that line?
The thing is that there isn't a firm line. At some point, the ban has to be lifted, and to an extent that will be arbitrary because there'll still be cases arising in China, that there'll still be risks, but you can't close the border to people from China indefinitely. It's just not feasible at many levels.
So Scott Morrison has announced the terms of reference for the Royal Commission into the bushfires, and they seem to focus on practical measures, on resilience and adaptation. So how much will the Royal Commission focus on climate change?
I think you'll find that there'll be some evidence where climate change is emphasised. If they take a range of witnesses, that would be inevitable. But on the whole, the government's position is it's recognised the fact that a changing climate does feed into the bushfire situation, makes things worse, makes the season earlier and so on. But the emphasis is very much on how you deal with the bushfire problem. And so the Royal Commission is not going to go to the question of whether we should have more measures to limit emissions. It's more looking at the legal framework, whether the Commonwealth needs more power to become involved in natural disaster management, and at things like hazard reduction, which is quite controversial, of course, in itself.
Okay, so the Leader of the Opposition's been busy this week. He's made a couple of significant speeches. The first one about superannuation, and that he said that Labor would fight any move to prevent the rise of the compulsory superannuation guarantee from growing ahead. So the rise has already been legislated. So is there any real risk to it?
I think there is a risk because there are quite significant voices saying that this rise should not go ahead. At present, the superannuation guarantee is 9.5%. It's due to go up in increments to 12% over a number of years. Now, some experts, like the Grattan Institute, for example, say that this is not the way to best deal with retirement income, and there are arguments that people need the money when they're younger, when they have costs of growing families and so on, rather than having it go into superannuation. Within the Liberal Party, there is a cohort of people who, well, indeed, some are against compulsory superannuation entirely, but are against this rise going ahead. I think the government, in its heart of hearts, would like to be able to scuttle the rise if it could. It would have to, of course, get that through the Senate, maybe take it to 10% and then not have any more. But Labor is making this an important issue. Of course, the superannuation guarantee goes right back to the Keating government. It's a Keating baby. And Paul Keating from time to time comes out with very angry rebuttals to those who say that the rise shouldn't go ahead. So this could become quite a contested issue, I think, over the next year or two. The government has an inquiry to establish the facts on retirement incomes, and after that the battle could be on for young and old.
Is it easy to unravel a piece of legislation though? I mean, just the process of it, is it actually a cumbersome thing to do?
Well, it would require another piece of legislation to repeal it or change it, and with the Senate crossbench, you never know how that would go.
Okay. So in another speech that Anthony Albanese is going to be delivering today, but we've seen some reportage of it already in the media this morning. So he's announcing that Labor supports a target of net zero emissions by 2050. So the Business Council and state governments have also committed to this target. So where does this leave the Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister refuses to commit to that target. He says he won't sign up to any target without knowing its impact on the economy, on jobs, on the regions and so on. Now, when you're looking at 2050, it's very hard to know what those impacts will be. Of course, you can have modelling, but so far ahead, really, modelling doesn't tell you anything precisely, and it depends on the assumptions you feed into it. But this target is now widely accepted, so the government is a bit out on a limb, I think. It's, of course, an aspirational target, although we do need roadmaps towards it if it's to be treated at all seriously. I think that the Prime Minister does feel increasingly hemmed in this whole debate about targets and climate change generally, of course, because on the one hand you've got moderate Liberals who are more and more speaking out and accepting that target. You've got, on the other hand, the Nationals who, fueled by their own internal divisions, are becoming more strident against any move to a target of that sort. So Scott Morrison talks about adopting technology over taxation. He keeps things vague, but increasingly this issue comes to a crunch for him, and I think it's going to be very difficult over the next few months.
Interestingly, though, that the government does have a 2030 target, and there's been early criticism of Albanese's speech that Labor doesn't have a 2030 target. Do you think that's a problem?
It's something of a problem, but it's not a serious problem for him, I don't think. Now, of course, at the last election, Labor had a 2030 target of 45% reduction of emissions, but it came under a lot of criticism for that being too ambitious. Anthony Albanese said that he thought that target should have been reviewed before the 2019 election, because it was the same target they'd taken into the previous election, and so it should have been looked at again. And there's debate within the Labor Party about whether that should be modified dramatically or only a bit or not at all. But I think that there is scope for Labor to keep its position fluid until much closer to the election, because it can argue, well, things are changing, the election's a long way away, and we want to see on the latest and best advice what the desirable target is sometime out from the election, but not too far out.
Okay. Well, Parliament sits again next week, so there'll be plenty to talk about then. So chat again next week, Michelle.
Thanks, Caroline. See you then.
Thanks, Michelle.